Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're heading deep into the ancient past of Guatemala, specifically to the Maya site of Ceibal. We've got a stack of, well, fascinating sources here, fresh research papers, detailed articles.
Yeah, really interesting stuff.
All centered on a recently studied cemetery that's really shaken up some long-held ideas.
That's right. Ceibal's been known for ages, hasn't it? As one of the oldest places in the Maya lowlands with major public buildings. Some go back over 3,000 years.
Right.
But with this deep dive, using these new sources, we're actually trying to peer even further back.
Okay.
We're using this cemetery, to understand what life looked like during a really critical transition period.
When people were just starting to settle down, moving away from being mobile.
Exactly. Shifting away from those mobile lifestyles. We're talking about the absolute beginnings of lowland Maya civilization.
So before the giant pyramids and the big cities we usually think of.
Way before. And these sources give us incredible detail right from the ground, the archaeology, the analysis of human bones.
And then, importantly, the interpretation of what it all means.
Yes. And as you hinted, finding this early burial ground, well, it really challenges how we thought people started rooting themselves to a place.
And burying their dead in a specific, dedicated way in this region.
Okay, let's maybe unpack this a bit. First, let's set the scene at Ceibal.
Right.
As you said, it's a big deal because it has some of the earliest evidence of large-scale construction in the whole Maya lowlands.
Yeah.
Archaeologists have focused for a long time on its early ceremonial structures, especially that E-group complex.
Ah, the E-groups. Those plaza layouts aligned for astronomy.
That's the one. They were actively building and using it by 950 BCE.
Okay, but the sources point out that while we knew about these big public spaces, the everyday lives, the social organization of the very earliest people, the folks before those big buildings, that's been more of a mystery, right?
Precisely. A bit of a black box. And this period is so critical, roughly 1200 to 800 BCE.
Bridging the Preceramic and Preclassic eras.
Exactly. It's that moment when groups are transitioning away from being mainly mobile foragers or maybe small-scale gardeners.
Towards relying more heavily on farming. Maize, presumably.
Yeah, especially maize. And understanding this shift usually depends on finding things like permanent buildings or durable stuff like early pottery or plant remains.
Things that last.
Right. The problem is actual burials from this specific time period are incredibly rare. Finding any is significant.
Let alone a whole group like this.
Absolutely. Which makes this discovery so pivotal.
So where did they actually find this window into the past? Not in the main plaza, I gather.
No, that's interesting too. Researchers were working at Ceibal between 2014 and 2023, but they were digging in a smaller, kind of less prominent area called the Amoch Group.
Amoch Group? Okay.
It's located about half a kilometer away, roughly a third of a mile from that main E-group center.
So a little bit removed from the main action, as it were. And what did they find there?
They found something quite unexpected for this early date. A coherent mortuary landscape.
Meaning, not just scattered bones.
Not just scattered burials, no. This is what the researchers describe as a dedicated cemetery area.
A proper cemetery.
Yeah. They excavated a total of 26 burials within the specific spot in the Amoch Group.
26 individuals. Finding that many together from this time period is, wow, that's incredibly rare. It tells us something immediately about their relationship with this place.
It really does. And the dating is absolutely key here, isn't it?
That's what I was wondering. How early are we talking?
It's the clincher. Yeah. This burial ground has been reliably dated to between 1100 and 800 BCE.
Okay, so let's place that. The E-group started around 950 BCE.
Exactly. So when you look at the timeline, that places this cemetery squarely within, or possibly even slightly before, the earliest phases of that big ceremonial construction at Ceibal's main center.
Wow. A dedicated cemetery, potentially existing before or right at the start of the major public architecture. That feels backwards somehow.
It does challenge some assumptions.
Okay, let's dig into the details from the graves themselves. What did they find? Who was buried here? How were they buried?
So the burials were found layered within this thin band of natural soil, just sitting right on top of the bedrock. One source describes it really well, calls this layer an archaeological twilight zone.
Twilight zone, why?
Well, it really captures that feeling of a group living a transitional life way, not yet building up deep layers of settlement debris, but using this shallow space for something as permanent as burial.
A twilight zone for people kind of straddling two worlds. And the individuals themselves, what positions were they in?
Most were laid out in an extended position on their backs, supine, as archaeologists call it.
Right.
Often their arms were folded across their pelvises or maybe their chests. A few were found with their knees bent or flexed.
Well, any variation?
Well, one person was on their side in a flexed position, but that might just be a variation of the flexed leg supine burial. It's hard to say for sure.
What about grave goods? That's often where we see status or beliefs pop up later on.
Right, and this is one of the most striking differences from what we usually associate with the Maya.
How so?
Absolutely no pottery was found associated with these burials. Zero.
No pottery at all. That's huge.
It is. And very few grave goods overall. Only a single burial included any durable offerings.
And what were they?
Just a couple of spherical stones. The researchers guess they could have been simple weapons or maybe some kind of symbolic markers. It's unclear.
Okay, so no pottery, almost no grave goods. That sounds completely different from the rich burials we see in later Maya cities.
It's a massive contrast, and the sources really emphasize what they call the egalitarian tone of the cemetery.
Egalitarian tone. What does that mean in this context?
It means individuals of all ages were buried there. Infants, children, adults, old adults, everyone.
No.
And archaeologically, there's just no clear evidence at all. No fancy offerings, no special placement, no distinct tomb structures, nothing to suggest any elite burials or markers of social or political status.
So unlike later Maya burials, which often seem to be about lineage, power, or land claims.
Exactly. This looks much more like a community burying its members together.
A more communal space, not just for a select few. Now, you mentioned later activities sometimes disturb these burials.
Yes, and that's another fascinating piece of the puzzle. Later Preclassic construction activities, building happening centuries later, sometimes cut into or moved these older burials.
Okay.
They found instances where a later burial was dug and the older bones were carefully repositioned, like a skull placed in the lap of an earlier skeleton or a jawbone on a pelvis.
Carefully repositioned, so not just bulldozed through.
Sometimes they were just cut through, like finding part of a femur shaft displaced by later construction. But other times, yes, there seems to have been care taken.
What do the sources make of that care?
Well, despite the disruption caused by later building, the fact that the older bones weren't always just scattered or smashed suggests that the people doing the later work knew the burials were there.
Ah, so the locations were remembered or marked somehow.
Possibly marked or just known through oral tradition. It indicates this specific spot held enduring cultural meaning for centuries after the first people were buried there. It wasn't just treated as empty ground.
Interesting. And the bones themselves, they must have stories to tell through bioarchaeology.
They certainly do. The analysis of the human remains gave us some crucial insights into the health and diets of these early folks.
Like what?
Well, dental analysis, for instance, showed high rates of things like parodic hyperostosis.
Which suggests anemia, right? Iron deficiency, maybe.
Often, yes. And also significant tooth decay. These are patterns we often see crop up in early agricultural societies.
As diets change. More reliance on starches.
Potentially, yeah. As diets shift from perhaps more varied wild resources towards more reliance on domesticates like maize.
So they definitely weren't pure foragers anymore, based on their health.
And the stable isotope analysis confirms that. It was performed on some of the burials.
What did that show about their diet?
It clearly points to a moderate intake of maize. So maize was part of the diet, but importantly, it was still significantly supplemented by meat and aquatic resources.
Oh, okay. So a mixed strategy.
Exactly. This evidence strongly supports the idea that these people weren't fully committed sedentary farmers, based entirely on intense maize farming.
But it weren't purely mobile foragers either.
Correct. They were, as one source really nicely puts it, straddling a threshold.
Straddling a threshold. That phrase really nails it, doesn't it? Right on the cusp of two lifeways.
It does.
Okay, so let's get to the so what. What's the real significance here? Finding a dedicated cemetery like this, potentially before the big public buildings or clear evidence of settled villages?
Well, what's fascinating here is that formal burial grounds, especially cemeteries located away from houses, typically emerge alongside increasing sedentism.
Right, people settling down.
And developing a stronger sense of territoriality. You're literally rooting yourself and your ancestors to the land by burying your dead there. This is particularly true as societies adopt agriculture and need to claim land.
Okay, that makes sense. But here at Ceibal.
Here at Ceibal, we seem to have one that's right there at the very beginning. The Amoch Cemetery appears to predate or be exactly contemporaneous with the earliest ceremonial center, that E group that got going around 950 BCE.
And maybe even before widespread pottery use or permanent houses at the main site?
Potentially, yes. It predates clear, definitive evidence for permanent residential settlement right at the main site center.
Huh. So this raises a really important question then. Could the cemetery itself have played a role in that transition?
How do you mean?
Like, did creating this burial ground help anchor people to this specific land, to tradition, and maybe to each other, before permanent villages and big temples became the main features?
That's precisely the key hypothesis the sources are proposing. The decision to build the main E-group complex nearby might very well have been influenced by the cemetery already being there.
Because it was already a culturally meaningful place.
Exactly. If practices like ancestor veneration or community remembrance were centered here, it could have been a powerful social glue.
Helping different groups or families create a shared identity, a sense of belonging to this place.
Yes, absolutely. And this might have laid some of the ideological groundwork for the more complex societal structures that popped up later, like kingship and lineage-based rule.
Which, as you mentioned, were strongly associated with burying people under houses later on, right? So this early communal cemetery is a very different pattern.
It's a huge difference. Later Maya practices often involved burying important individuals directly under the floors of houses or in lineage shrines. This linked the dead ancestor directly to the living family, reinforcing their power and validating claims over specific homes or land.
Whereas the Amoch Cemetery seems more focused on a shared communal space away from individual houses.
A very different social and symbolic statement, it seems.
Okay, so despite all these fascinating revelations, there are still some unanswered questions hanging around this cemetery, aren't there?
Oh, absolutely. Research always opens up new questions. For instance, that complete absence of pottery with these early burials, it's quite puzzling.
Especially if people nearby at the E group might have been starting to use ceramics.
Right. The sources basically present two main possibilities to try and make sense of this lack of pottery.
Okay, what are they?
Well, one possibility is that this specific group, using the Amoch Cemetery, just hadn't widely adopted pottery technology yet.
Even if they were interacting with neighbors who had.
Potentially. It could suggest different groups in the area with slightly varied lifeways, or maybe even some kind of cultural resistance to adopting ceramics by this particular community. Who knows?
Interesting. Or what's the second possibility?
The second possibility is that they had adopted pottery, they knew about it, maybe used it for cooking or storage.
But they just didn't use it in burials.
Exactly. For whatever reason, they simply chose not to include pottery vessels in their mortuary rituals, specifically at the Amoch Group Cemetery during this period.
Maybe the simplicity of the grave goods overall points to that. Rituals not focused on durable items.
That could be part of it. Early ritual and remembrance here might not have been tied to durable symbols like pottery or wealth in the way they clearly were later on.
And what about those different burial positions you mentioned? Mostly extended, but some flexed. Any clearer ideas on that?
That's another area the sources acknowledge needs more research. The differences could reflect slightly different mortuary traditions among various groups using the cemetery over its, couple hundred years of use.
Or maybe practices changed over time within the same group.
That's possible too, especially since at least one flexed burial actually cuts into an extended one, suggesting they weren't perfectly separate traditions happening at the same time necessarily.
Is there any other interpretation?
Well, another intriguing idea they raise is that the flexed position might indicate individuals who died somewhere else, away from Ceibal,
And were brought back.
and were transported back to the specific cemetery for burial, perhaps bundled or wrapped, leading to a flexed posture.
Transported back.
Ah.
What would that imply about their lives?
It would imply that even as people were developing these stronger ties to Ceibal, marked by the cemetery, they weren't necessarily 100% sedentary yet.
Still moving around to some extent.
Possibly. They might still have had some degree of mobility, enough maybe to be away from the main settlement when they died, but also a deep enough connection to bring their deceased back to this meaningful burial ground.
Fascinating. Is there ongoing research that might clarify some of this?
Yes, the sources mention that ongoing genetic analysis of the remains might help clarify relationships among the individuals buried here, maybe those buried together or in different positions. That could shed more light on who exactly was using the cemetery and perhaps where they came from.
So, pulling it all together then, what does this early cemetery really contribute to our overall understanding of, the bigger picture of Maya origins?
Well, Ceibal was already a landmark site, wasn't it? Because it showed monumentality, big public building projects appearing before full-blown urbanization.
Right. big temples before dense cities,
The Amoch Cemetery adds another, possibly even earlier, foundational layer to that story. It shows us that the creation of social landscapes.
establishing deep ties to a place through burial and remembrance.
Exactly. That process may have actually preceded both the large ceremonial buildings and widespread permanent residential settlements.
It's giving us a rare glimpse into that incredibly complex, kind of messy, in-between time during the transition.
It really is. This early cemetery offers a unique window into those overlapping and complicated phases of cultural transformation as people were gradually moving away from purely mobile lifeways.
And the sources also highlight how the later shift away from this kind of cemetery tells a story too.
Definitely. That dramatic shift in mortuary practices we see in later centuries, moving away from this dedicated communal cemetery towards burials, associated more with individual houses and ceremonial centers, that likely reflects the full adoption of sedentary life, probably new religious beliefs, and the development of concepts like private land ownership and clear social hierarchy.
So this deep dive into the Amoch Cemetery, it really gives us a different, more nuanced picture of early Maya life than the one centered just on the big buildings.
A much richer picture.
It shows us a community starting to weave these deep, lasting ties to a specific place through their dead, perhaps even before they fully settle down or birth the major structures we usually associate with them.
It absolutely reframes how we think about the very foundations of their civilization in some ways.
So here's something to think about as you go about your day. How might that seemingly simple but profound act of burying and remembering the dead together in a designated spot, how might that have been one of the earliest ways complex human societies began to root themselves and build a shared identity? What does that tell us about the enduring power of place and memory in shaping who we become, long before the more visible signs of civilization, like cities and monumental temples, even appear on the landscape?